In this video tutorial, we're going to take the temperature calculator converter that we created in a previous video, and it was designed to just take in a Fahrenheit temperature, and when we click convert, it would convert it to Celsius. So what we're going to do is add on to the functionality of this so that the user will be able to enter either a Fahrenheit or a Celsius temperature, and we'll have two different buttons where they'll be able to convert the temperature. So to start out with, I'm going to make some modifications to our interface design. So I'm going to pop up our panel over to the side, and instead of Fahrenheit temperature, we're just going to change this to just regular temperature. And we're going to have two different buttons, one to convert to Celsius and one to convert to Fahrenheit. So let's say this is to Celsius, and I'm going to duplicate this button. So if I hold down my Option key and click and drag, I can get a copy of this. All right, this is already connected to our calculation, our method in our implementation file. All right, it's already connected to the convert temp method. So by duplicating it, we don't need to reconnect the new button to that. So I'm going to come back and let's just change this to Fahrenheit. And we'll still put our result into this text label below here. So I'm just going to double check my connections. If I select my button and I right click, we can see that on touch up inside, it's connected to the convert temp method. And we'll double check our copied button. I'll right click, touch up inside, connected to convert temp. So both of these buttons will do the same method. So we're getting one input from the user, and then depending on which button is being clicked, it's going to do a different calculation and show the result in here. So we're going to have one method that's going to handle both of these buttons. Now I'm going to look at the implementation file. Let me split this screen so that we can kind of see both things going on at once. Right, the to Celsius is connected to the convert temp method, and to Fahrenheit is also connected to the convert temp method. Now our method is set up so that we have ID sender. And so what that allows us to do is to capture information about these buttons that are causing it to trigger this method or this IB action. So what we'll need to do is to modify this a little bit so that it will be able to recognize which button was clicked and then do something different. It's going to run a different formula depending on which button. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to first of all, just going to move this up to the top a little bit so that it is a little easier to see. And we have some things in here that we'll want to keep, and we may need to do a little bit of checking first. So first of all, I'm just going to move this down, and I'm going to comment out each of these lines, and we'll copy and uncomment them as we need them. First of all, let's just look at the process of how to recognize which button was being clicked. And then once we know that that part works, then we'll work on implementing the functionality for each button. So I'm going to come into the View Controller implementation file, which is where our code is. And let me come out of the Assistant Editor. So we have more screen space. Okay, so what we want to do is to capture the information coming in from the sender so that we can identify which button is actually being clicked. So the first thing we need to do in here is to create a button object. So UI button, and I'm going to give it a name, and I'm just going to call it the button. And we need to set that equal to a UI button object type, and we're going to grab the sender information from it. Okay, now that we have a button object, we'll be able to get some information from it. So we'll say if right? And it gives us the setup here for our if statement. We have a condition check in here. So we want to say if the button that we created, and we can get some information about that button, and it's actually current title. So we can say if the button's current title is equal. Now you might be tempted to use these double equal signs, but since we're checking text, we're going to be using is equal, and now we're going to specify the string that we wanted to check for. So is equal, and then our strings go inside double quotes after the @ sign. So let's say 2 to Celsius. And then inside our curly braces we have our statements. So we haven't covered yet how to do a log statement. So let's just say nslog. And what this will do is it'll print a little information back to us to the screen. So it's a quick way of doing some checking to see whether your code is working or not before we get too more advanced in any of our coding. So let's do an nslog statement, and we'll say they clicked Celsius, right? And then we have, let's see, it's still showing me an error here. I have if the button current title equal. I think I need a square bracket there. Yes, that fixes it. Okay, so let's just see if we tap the 2 Celsius button that we get a log statement that will show this. So I'm going to run this in my simulator. Okay, so it's building and compiling. Build succeeded is good. Okay, and we don't even need to worry about the temperature right now because all that we have it set up for is if we click to Celsius, then we have our log statement showing up here, clicked Celsius. And then Fahrenheit doesn't do anything because it doesn't meet the if statement. Right, so we created a button object, and then we can get some properties of our button object, and one of them is automatically available is the current title. So we're checking to see if the current title on the button that was the sender is equal to 2 Celsius, and then display a log statement. So let's just say else. So we'll have our else statement. So if they didn't click Celsius, then they must have clicked to Fahrenheit. So let's rerun this. And Fahrenheit, clicked Fahrenheit, clicked Celsius. Okay, so now we are sure that our buttons are doing what we needed them to do, or that we're able to identify which button was being clicked. So this is one method or one way of being able to get and check to see if the button title is equal to something. Let me show you another way that we'll be able to do the same thing, only instead of using the title, we're going to use what's called a tag. And I'm going to go back here to the nib file, and I'm going to set up, opening up the attributes panel. And if I click on a button, what we can do is in the attributes is an attribute called tag. And both of these automatically have tag information of 0. So I'm going to say if Celsius, so instead of saying 0, I'm going to say 1. So Celsius is going to be 1. And let's make Fahrenheit 2. Right, so now we have a tag that uniquely identifies Celsius and Fahrenheit. So in my code, I can use tag instead of finding out the current title. So I can say if the button tag, and now we can check for a numerical value. So if it's equal to 1, they clicked Celsius, and we have an else, but we could put another if statement in here. If the button.tag is equal to 2, then they click Fahrenheit. So let's just check that and see if it still runs okay in the simulator. So we'll say to Celsius, we clicked Celsius, and then Fahrenheit. So it does the same thing, just another option. Just wanted to show you how you might be able to use this tag information. Okay, so now let's complete the implementation of this. Now before we only had one value coming in, and we knew that the amount coming in was automatically the Fahrenheit because we were converting it to Celsius. So this time, instead of using Fahrenheit, we know that it could be either one. So I'm going to put this up, and I'm going to, instead of calling this Fahrenheit, I'm just going to call this input. Right? So we have a double value coming in, and we don't know if it's Fahrenheit or Celsius, so we're just going to give it a generic name called input. Now inside the if and the else, we can put in our conversion and put the result into the result label. Right? So if they clicked 1, then they're converting to Celsius. So I'm going to put this up here. Now I copied that, and it says, well, it doesn't, I'm getting the error here. Undeclared identifier Fahrenheit. Right down here, the amount coming in from the text, the input text field was called Fahrenheit. Here, it's actually called input. So we're going to take the amount of the input and do our math calculation to figure out the temperature. And then we're going to create a string. So again, I'm going to copy this, and we see what we might have to change in this. Once we do our calculation, we want to create a result, and we have an amount coming in. We're going to say if they're converting to Celsius, then the amount coming in is Fahrenheit, and this is converting it to Celsius. But again, the amount coming in is no longer called Fahrenheit, it's called input. And now we're going to take that string and put it into our result label. So we can copy this and put it in. Okay, so let's test it and see if the Celsius conversion works. So let's rerun it. Need to set that up so that it displays numbers. Okay, so we put in 32 degrees Fahrenheit, or a number in here, tell it to convert to Celsius. And so 32 degrees Fahrenheit is 0 degrees Celsius. So let me switch back here to the interface real quick, and let's change this so that the keyboard displays numbers and punctuation. Make it a little easier. Okay, and back in the implementation file, now we need to do the conversion for Fahrenheit. So I'm just going to, it's going to work the same way. We need to get a double value for Fahrenheit, so we're going to put in a formula here to convert to Fahrenheit. Then we're going to create a string with our result information in it. So I'm just going to paste that in to save a little typing. And then we're going to put our result label in with the result. Okay, so now we're ready to test. So let's run this. So we'll just double check and make sure Celsius still works. So 32 degrees is 0 degrees Celsius. And let's try. We know 100 degrees Fahrenheit is 100 degrees Celsius converts to 212 Fahrenheit. So our calculations do work. And it is picking up which button is being clicked and then displaying the proper result. Now, something that you may have noticed is that once you get the keyboard popped up here, you can't get rid of it. A lot of times if you tap outside here or you tap the return key, it will retract the keyboard. But Apple doesn't automatically do that for us. We actually have to implement some method in order to get this to retract back again. So let's look at how we do that. Okay, let's go back into the implementation file, and what we're going to do is write a method that's going to hide the keyboard. So I'm just going to add it up at the top here so it's easier to see. This is going to be an IB action, and that's because this is going to be something that is triggered from the interface, either clicking on one of the buttons or maybe even clicking will set it also up so that if you tap the background it will retract the keyboard. So IB action, and let's call this action hide keyboard, and we'll keep ID sender in there, and we'll put in our curly braces. Now the way we write this is we can say sender, and it's resign first responder. Now the first responder is, for example, if you're clicked in this text box, this text box is the first responder. So next what we need to do is to connect this text field to the hide keyboard method. So we'll go back into Interface Builder, and I'm going to pull up the Assistant Editor. We also need to define our method in our file here, so we'll do IB action, and we called it hide keyboard. Now we want to connect our text field to that particular action. So I'm going to right click on it, and our event is did end on exit. So when we're finished editing this, right, we can connect this right to the hide keyboard method. So I'm going to save that, and I'm going to rerun it in the simulator. So now if I type in a number, and then we haven't set up the buttons to do anything yet, so I'm just going to tap return, and now the keyboard retracts. When you tap back in here, it pops back up again. So the resign first responder becomes the keyboard. When we click in here, the first responder becomes the keyboard, and when we tap the return key, we are telling it to resign the first responder. Okay, so this works, but now these buttons don't do anything about retracting the keyboard. So let's set these buttons up. So you would think that if we connected these buttons to the hide keyboard method that it would work. So let's try that and just see what happens. So I'm going to right click on the button, and we have touch up inside, and we also want, when touch up inside happens, to hide the keyboard, right? So when this is tapped, we want it to hide the keyboard. So I'm going to click and drag from here over to the hide keyboard method, and then I can see that it's been added in under the touch up inside. Okay, so let's test this. Right, so we tap here, and to Celsius doesn't retract the keyboard. But if I come down here and I tap the return key, that still works. So what's going on? Why isn't that working? Okay, think about it in this manner. We have your temperature text field, and it is actually, when we tap in here, it brings up the keyboard, and when we tap return, we're saying sender resign first responder. So this text field is actually the sender, and this is what would resign first responder. So when we're tapping this button, this is not the button that made the keyboard pop up. So we're going to add a little bit more into this hide keyboard method to accommodate working with a button. So instead of sender resign first responder, we can be specific, and we can say, well, our text field is actually called temp input. So let's use temp input resign first responder. Okay, and so now let's see if that works. So we're saying that when this button is clicked, we're going to be specific and say temp input resign first responder. So we're going to, rather than saying this button to resign first responder, which is the sender, which isn't what really triggered it, we're going to go back and say temp input is what triggered it, and so temp input should resign its first responder. So let's try running this in the simulator again, and if I just tap in here and tap to Celsius, then it does in fact retract the keyboard. So now we can connect our Fahrenheit button the same way, right? Touch up inside, so when the button is tapped, we want it to do the hide keyboard, and I can close that, and we will test and make sure now that both buttons are able to retract the keyboard. Yes. So it looks like those are all working. And now one other thing for retracting the keyboard, a lot of times you may have worked on apps where if you tap on the back part of the screen that it retracts the keyboard. So there's a little trick to this one, and basically we're just going to create an invisible button around this area and then connect it to the hide keyboard method that's already created. So I'm going to go back out and we're going to add a round rectangle button. I'm going to drag it up onto my screen. And before I do anything else with formatting this, I'm just going to make sure that that is connected to the hide keyboard method. So I'm going to right click on it and choose touch up inside, and I'm going to connect that to the hide keyboard method. So I'm just going to check and make sure that that button works. So we tap in here, tap the button, and it retracts. So everything else still works the way it did before. Now we can go back in and format this button. Right, so what I'm going to do is select this button. I'm going to make it cover a larger part of the screen. And so now you can see, well, it's covering up everything, and so that's not a good thing. So I'm going to change the type of button from round rectangle to custom. And so now it becomes invisible. So if I test this again, when I go to click in to type in something, temperature or any of these buttons, I'm actually being blocked by the button, because this button, even though it's a custom button and it's invisible, it's sitting on top of everything. And you can look in Interface Builder, and in the object listing you can see here that we have the view, and the way things are stacked in here is that what is on the bottom layer is actually on the top of things over here. So if you're used to using Flash or Photoshop or something else, it's reversed. So this button is sitting on top of everything else that's in our view. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click and drag this basically to the bottom of the view. So now it should be underneath everything else. So let me try running it again. Right now I'm able to type in here and tap on the background in order to make the keyboard retract. And so there you have it.